Well, hello, Marianna Simnett. I'm delighted to welcome you to Harry Woodlock's series held at the Courtauld Research Forum, Vital Exhaustion. A quick thank you, of course, to all involved, for Harry Woodlock for putting us both together for this particular broadcast, to all the Research Forum team for facilitating everything, of course. And first of all, I'd like to begin with one of your works that many, many people may have seen and either looked at or been affected by subliminally. And that is your famous or infamous tube poster called Sleeping Birds in Flight.
Wing Sleepers.
Wing Sleepers is even more beautiful because what it is luminescently psychedelic birds whose brains have slightly switched off while they're zooming through the night. So this was very, very appropriate for the tube poster. But what I wanted to say is you could have put them all going up. You could have put them all flying from left to right. But of course, as it's you, they're all plunging down into the Gulf, because you are a very interesting artist who's not only interested in the inner parts of the body, like brains and programming, but also shock and horror. And with that image of these beautiful birds who suddenly, through your artistic manipulation, have plunged down to we know not what, possibly a dark gulf, not a smash on the ground, I want to recite this phrase which hit you, which is your extraordinarily, extraordinarily appropriate détournement, one could say, of the dawn chorus. Because for most people, especially people deprived of birds, if they ever wake up in a strange hotel or on a camping holiday and hear the dawn chorus, it's the most beautiful and surprising experience of the natural world. Instead of which you select this quotation by Kurt Cobain, which says, "Birds scream at the top of their lungs in horrified, hellish rage every morning at daybreak to warn us all of the truth. But sadly, we don't speak bird." And this was a piece you did with, possibly in COVID times, with you playing the flute. So again, you've turned something which we could think of as absolutely glorious phenomenon of the natural world into something horrifically dark. So you are a very interesting artist to me because, to be very frank, you're beautiful blonde. There's that lovely picture of you all greenish, kissing nonetheless a crow on the front of the beautiful digital version of your life and work that I've studied. And yet your work is tinged with horror and the macabre. And before we go on to that, I'd like to say that back to Harry, whose work in Venice, it was called Breathless, the big exhibition he curated. So the work that Harry would like us to focus on is your work called Faint with Light, which we're going to go on to talk about. And this is where you make yourself breathless, and there's a long story behind that. But in as much as we're going to zoom forward to Faint with Light, I'd like really to fill in a little bit of background, because in fact, you're not, as it were, an English, but a British artist, and you were born in London, but you had a very specific and unusual upbringing. So maybe you'd like to tell us about the specificity of your upbringing and also your early training in music, performance, and so forth that feeds into the works we're about to discuss.
Thank you for having me and for taking such a thorough look at my work. It's a real pleasure. So I grew up in Kingston upon Thames. That's where I was born, and my mother is Croatian, former Yugoslavian, and my father is English. And I grew up in a bit of a mini Yugoslavia in the suburbs of London. In the way I went to Yugoslavian school on Saturday, we had an au pair who was Bosnian. We had a very Croatian-speaking household. My father left when I was very young, And so it was really, we also didn't watch television, we didn't listen to music, we didn't do all of the sort of Americanized style of children growing up in England. You know, we didn't have that. We had a black and white TV with a little turn dial, and it was only watched on Saturdays for an hour. And it was sort of, there was a lot of restraint and ritual and rule making. And then I had quite extreme other life with my father, who I used to see at weekends, and he was living on a boat, and he would remove a lot of the strictures or try and untie them at the weekends, and encourage me to develop what was clearly becoming my language within art from a young age. And so then I went to a performing arts school later, the Arts Educational School, where half the day was vocational dance, drama and music and art, and the rest of the day was academic subjects.
That's great. And of course, music is so important for you, and interestingly suppressed in Faint with Light. I just want to say, in terms of your description of your very unusual childhood, that you've chosen to have as your backdrop for this the poster which says, "My reality is biased. I vow to unlearn."
It's actually not. This is actually a different one.
Oh, it's the same. It's this. I've got one here. I'll just show everybody.
I know,
Very similar one. This says, "My reality is biased. I vow to unlearn."
Yeah.
So that is very interesting, because you've both. Nobody can unlearn. That's the point, isn't it? And so this Yugoslavian story plays through all your work in a very interesting way. So I just wanted to ask you a little bit about this oral tradition before we go on to Faint with Light. Most children, even if they're contaminated by television, as they always are nowadays, they still learn fairy tales. In Victoria Park, my COVID place, I've heard children singing "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star." I couldn't believe they were still singing it. So there's a way in which the fairy tale and its merging with tales of Yugoslavia and other tales are really constituting a part of your mental universe, which then fuses with very English things like the site of Waddesdon Manor for one of your pieces and so forth. So could you just say a little bit again, when we go back to your childhood and this idea of narrative, which is so important in your work, about your learning of tales, and how you decided in most of your work that the idea of the tale or the story or the narrative would be so important?
Yeah, I mean, it's still, I think I find narrative so troubling, partly because of the ones impressed upon us without choice, and partly because of the possibility of being able to construct one's own. And I think I have always been fascinated, by invention and imagination as a tool to separate yourself from the normal world that you live in, and to be able to actually indulge in that universe, but not in a frivolous way, but more to pass a threshold, and to sort of dare to think outside of your current existence. And so narrative can be very difficult if you've been handed one that's been very traumatic. And in my case, I come from a history of people who are much greater sufferers than I could be, and yet the story still holds. And so what do you do with that feeling that you grow up with this feeling of heaviness, and also perhaps a sort of delight and glee in being able to conjure things?
Yes, indeed, because whereas I was very marked by an encounter with a Holocaust survivor, we're not talking about that, but we're talking about atrocity, firing squads, and even more dreadful if you think of the collapse of the former Yugoslavia, of friends becoming enemies and enemies turning against friends. And then this dreadful moment. Perhaps we'll leap forward to Faint with Light, and then we'll think about how that plays out in the more fairy tale-like other pieces, including the musical ones.
The piece is an installation that is it's an installation, it's a sculpture, and it's a light piece, and it consists of a large metal wall which divides the room into two on a diagonal, and that metal wall is housed with bars of LED strips of light which are extremely blinding, and they rise and fall to the sound of me making myself faint. And you hear the sound of my breath, essentially hyperventilating to the point of unconsciousness. You don't see my body, you just hear the process. You hear the breathing, then you hear me do a sort of faint choke, and then a loud groan, and then silence, and then some short panicked breath upon waking, and then again. And this happens 4 times.
And the public can walk around, but the power of the light actually blinds them visually to a certain extent, as well as
it's a disorienting experience. Some people can't stay in the room. It can be too much. I think what it does is it forces people to make a decision. Either way, you have to act as a viewer. You're unable to, you either get hypnotized. It also leaves an after image on your retina because it's so bright that you're still seeing light afterwards. And yeah, you can walk behind and become invisible, or to watch others watching the work.
So from a formal point of view, that is what we would see, and that is what we would experience in a way that is quite an assault, both optically and orally. And as you say, there's this decision involved. But if we actually read how we are supposed to understand the piece more deeply, it is related to this memory you have, which you've probably even visualized yourself, of your Jewish Croatian grandfather in a firing squad, suddenly fainting, so that he was left for dead, but then waking up and discovering amongst corpses and the atrocities of war that he was alive. Very traumatic experience, of course.
Yeah,
I'd like you both to tell me about that, but I'd like to know to what extent the audience is alerted to that narrative, or not at all, in a gallery setting.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I don't think that the work needs that story. That was my impetus. I don't sometimes, in fact, in some exhibition texts, I leave it out, because the more I talk, the more I'm happy to talk about it again today, because I've actually found some details yesterday that I hadn't known until then. I just discovered a newspaper article that was published about that story. And it's been really incredible to read it in such detail, because it had been handed to me as a myth. And of course, when you learn a myth or a story or a fairy tale, you don't have the nuances. You have the same nursery rhyme way of telling the tale. And I was kind of feeling a little bit guilty, or like I was instrumentalizing his story, or saying it the same way again and again, like it was a trick or a joke. And so I have a lot of problem with having that as the banner with the work, because actually what happens with the work is it's a void. Essentially, the work is a big giant void for people that is so devoid of emotion. I consider it a self-portrait, actually. But it's so devoid of emotion in terms of it just being metal and light. That's all I consist of in that room. You can hear me, you can't see me, but people bring their deepest fears and emotions to that work often, and people have fallen over being sick or cried and jumped around. It's been very effective, but not because the work itself is particularly giving off a lot of emotion itself. So it's
very interesting, because that brings us to that idea of a physiological response. And normally in performance art, even in your other pieces, we'll go back to Faint with Light, but even in, say, the needle and the larynx, there's this idea of empathic projection, where we go ouch when we see the needle go into your neck. But in this idea of disembodiment, which you are almost implying is a truer self-portrait.
Yeah.
I think it's very, very interesting.
Yeah, exactly.
And in terms of you saying, I think it's very interesting that you said like a trick or a joke, because this gets us onto the issue of the relationship of fairy tales in their little tiny cut up bits, you know, the battle of the princess, the fight and so forth, the way that these are tropes which can actually be interchangeable and also deeply psychoanalyzable. They really lend themselves to that. And so this is what I think is interesting in your work, that in all your work where these fairy tale tropes, and I don't know, of course, at the moment, if somebody in the very, very impressive and very long bibliography that you have has actually, I was going to even say, needled in on this, which shows how Freud is working even as one speaks. If they've really pointed that out. It just so happens that I was very interested in the Grimm Museum, the Grimm Fairy Tales new museum installation in Kassel, where people like Susan Hiller and even people who had been forced to paint fairy tales in concentration camps were making notionally contemporary art pieces. And I actually did quite a bit of work on the evolution of the history of fairy tales and the difference in Russia and in England. It was electrical Russia. Well, and of course we all learn Grimm. And so that's why I think your, on the one hand, your use of fairy tale and the macabre, a lot of your press says, gosh, it's really grim, it's visceral, but they don't really seem to understand the fairy tale trope, and yet how that relates not just to oral history, but the way that oral history itself wants to turn things into a tale. Exactly. And in that case, even for second or third generation Holocaust survivors or anything, there's the problem of the tale, as you say yourself, which is related to the issue of guilt and even shame, because one of my friends is of Croatian and Serbian heritage, as so many people are in Yugoslavia, which actually the word means a yoking together, as we know, a yoking together of states. So the yoke was broken brutally, and for people who are half one thing and half the other, that break becomes a break inside them. So I think this whole issue is really, I don't know what you have to say to that, but the way that it relates to the psyche, you're interested as well in the kind of apparatuses and the medical apparatuses and even the apparatuses of milk production that we don't see, this kind of horrible, we have our biological machinery behind us, but also the horrible industrial machinery that produces the so-called natural behind us as well.
Exactly.
There's even that idea of kind of malevolent machinery in Faint with Light when you actually look at the mechanisms of how it's
I sort of imagine it like, I also would want to clarify something about the execution in a second, but I see it almost like a body on a life support machine, or a body that's in a coma being kept alive by a machine. If that was a self-portrait, that's how I see myself in that work.
Indeed, you know, if you would no longer existed, that is how part of you, through mechanical apparatus, would be projected into the future.
Exactly. And so just about this that I've learned, because I didn't know exactly how he was shot at, and it does seem like a bit of a miraculous story to be fainting at the same time as you're supposed to be shot. But that did happen, and it happened when he was being moved between different concentration camps, and he jumped off a truck with another prisoner from Haiti. And I think the prisoner got shot and he fainted at the same time. So there were just two of them actually. And this was my vagueness that has now been turned into a mass execution within the press. But I'm now going to start rectifying that from today, just to clean it up, because I've now for the first time heard it from himself through this article.
It was his voice. Was it a direct quote in the newspaper?
Direct quote, yeah.
That's so moving. And I think you told me that just before he died, you found this enormous article he'd written at the age of 86, which is...
Well, I didn't even find it. My mum just sent it to me yesterday.
Yeah, well, that's very... So really, in some ways, our interview is coming at a moment of shock and, if you like, strangely enough, rediscovery as opposed to discovery, a corrective rediscovery. And so once again, this is insisting upon the fact that your day-to-day life can never escape this particular narrative, even when it's boiled down to breath and light. I find this extraordinarily, extraordinarily moving. I presume it was your training as a singer as well, when you said the thing about your glottis, that enabled you to do this, because would an ordinary person be able to do the breathing that you did?
Anyone with a will. Yeah.
Yes.
It's not something that I could do immediately. I had to teach myself how to do it.
But as an artist, you've subjected yourself to certain dangers, and even when they're demystified by medical science, certain kinds of apprehensions that you record live, like indeed we said the needle in the larynx, and there are other that's repeated, you know, with little boys in The Worst Gift, when you explore the effect of Botox on the voice. And then I understand that what you're walking through before we see the nice little neat bottles of product is like the huge apparatus of a Botox factory. And so, of course, this brings me personally, not any other critic, back to my own personal relationship with Orlan, where she was submitting herself to these dreadful operations as a critique of female beauty. Now, you're not encountering these dangers and these assault on your own face and neck, the place of the classical bust, as an exploration or critique of beauty, but something very different. So how would you talk about the relationship in all your work and the idea of self-risk, and the idea of self-risk in relationship to your public?
Yeah, well, firstly, I think that all of my more risky works upon myself and the body are recordings, and they're never performed live. When I do live work, it tends to be much more theatrical, explicitly theatrical. So I use props and the flute and a bird and signifiers, and I don't really go there, you know. I seem to be insisting on a disappearance of the body rather than the presence. It's almost like in Faint with Light that I'm completely absent. It's almost like, you know, I could have actually faked it. Of course I didn't, but there's something about the removal of myself as a figure, as a female figure, and removal of the gore. All the gore in my work tends to be artificial. There's nothing, you know, it's prosthetics. It's when I'm actually doing something, it's much more about interiority and the psyche, or something much less about skin.
So I'd like to get back to this idea of the fact that these narratives form us in some way, and many of your pieces, including Bird Game, for example, set in Waddesdon Manor, use child actors who enact these semi-dangerous stories. And in a way, they're like a chorus to your more me-focused works. Could you just say a little bit about how you expand from you yourself as artist focus of a performance to these more orchestrated works, which of course have their sound accompaniment, either a story or music?
With the children, I like to create environments or games for them to play in, and so there is an element of danger or surprise for them when they're on the set. You know, they are having to be aware of the crow, or in real life as well as in the fiction, and they are slightly terrified a lot of the time. And they're also having a lot of fun, and I think I create these parameters for them where the normal moral codes that we live by don't quite exist in the normal way, and they have to adapt to learn this new universe that we're all creating together. And so that's a type of play with boundaries or thresholds and borders that I deliberately encourage, I suppose, within the more crafted narratives.
And when you turn them into quasi-operatic things, however macabre the story is, I'm very impressed by the beauty and the ethereal nature of a lot of your music, which obviously relates to your collaborations as well. But this very beautiful soundtrack is, of course, a question of harmonies. Could you just say a tiny bit before we get back to Faint with Light, which specifically doesn't have music, of how important music is for you? Because it does seem to me that you must have a pleasure not only in imagining scenarios and imagining narratives, because you're a great storyteller, but actually imagining these beautiful musical accompaniments.
I think it comes down to synthesis, and music has a really wonderful way of being able to group together very dissonant moments. And I think that's something that I've always come back to is a need or a thrill in being able to occupy many planes and dimensions and have them all there in the same space, in the same breath. And so not only are the musical numbers a bit of a relief from the macabre story that we're telling, but maybe an aside or a jutting out or a kind of, what's it called, intermezzo, like a moment out of the story, but also it's a tool for me to put cockroaches and varicose veins together, or to put, to put Botox in these young boys and these strange worlds into one space. So, and also harmony and agreement in a way.
You're like the princess, the witch, and the Pied Piper all together, in some ways. I just was impressed by the harmony and thinking about one of the latest things in art history, i.e. neural art history, and having sung myself. When you use very high music and very beautiful harmonies, there's obviously not just an oral effect to do with hearing music, but there's a very strange effect on the brain as well. And I think that your interest in not just performer and public, but our receptors is very much at stake in a lot of what you do from that point of view.
Yeah, I think that we can never really understand what we understand, if that makes sense. We can never really get there. And I really do believe in those other receptors that are working on behalf of us, and that they are great forces. There are great forces at play, both for me as a maker and for my audience. And so I try to, some of my more strange choices are perhaps because I'm speaking to the less conscious realms, some odd sounds or images that might get I don't put things in by accident. I'm pretty.
And if we think of Grimm and the grimness of the Brothers Grimm, actually you are making a complete Gesamtkunstwerk experience out of what, in their case, remains the narrative, although the narrative that gives itself to so many things. But I'd like to get back almost finally, I think, because I would like to give a compliment in parenthesis to your musical collaborators and to your power in writing scores as well as writing stories, to an aspect which is also disturbing, I think, in Faint with Light, because one cannot deny that this breathlessness for the spectator, as well as an all-round experience, there's a feeling of climax and then a feeling of groan, which gives it sometimes a very uncomfortable or different semi-sexual dimension. And in your work, one has only to mention the way that in Tito's Dog, the question of whether animals can commit suicide Tito's, the covering and the stud farm. There's this way, and your horrible or beautiful / horrible hyena swan sculpture. There's this idea of monstrous couplings and of coupling itself as problematic, and the violence of animal coupling, which can obviously translate into the violence of human coupling. And so the breathlessness, which you're saying is a self-portrait, has got that dimension as well, not just the last breath dimension, but the gasp and the climax and the groan dimension. And I wondered if how you superimpose those two layers, each of which has got a disturbing meaning.
Yeah. Are we here? Can you hear me?
Yes, indeed.
Good,
yeah.
Good. Wow, you've really gone in there. There's a lot to say. In terms of are we talking about the sound and the relation between sex and death and orgasm and
I think
climax?
We are, yes. Well, which was used to be called the Little Death.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. There is so much proximity. And I just made another 16mm film called Pillow, in which I film dead animals collectively having a real roadkill that I found. Roadkill, yeah. And they are having an orgy together. So again, there's this congregation of different species, which is often coming up in my work, that there's a wrongness or things that go together that aren't supposed to be together. And I really endorse that. And what's amazing is that quite explicitly, maybe in Faint with Light, there's the audio track that really sounds like you don't really know whether I'm dying or, or having the biggest orgasm of my life. And similarly with the animals, I've just discovered that they're so entwined. Their mouths, when they're open and dead, they look like they're, it's the same thing. And I can't believe how beautifully these languages just go together without me even trying. I didn't do that noise. I was unaware. And so the animals were unaware. It's something innate. There's something innate about it that's bigger than us.
In a way, it's the moment of death is the moment of either transcendence or turning into a different state.
Exactly.
Even if it's a state of decay. And it's a very extraordinary thing that moment is the leitmotif of all your creative output in some ways.
Yeah, it's true. And that Faint with Light for me is about, transformation. Essentially, if you travel somewhere, you dare to go to that threshold, and when you come back, you're not the same person.
No, I think actually that is a very, very poignant and important place with which we could end our conversation, hoping that we are going to have many conversations in the future, because this has been a great pleasure for me. But also I feel, in terms of that point, the point of death, which comes back into your work, it makes me feel quite humble as an art historian. Normally we're looking, even in paintings or sculptures, even in gory paintings or prostrate sculptures, they can't actually deal with that moment of passage. And so it's a moment which, as you know yourself, is impossible to put into words unless metaphorically, or you're living of that moment, which you actually live in Breathless and Light, which I think, as I said, is the most courageous work. So unlike your, as it were, figurative stories and musicalized stories, and yet, as you say, your self-portrait, a self-portrait which you're saying is going to, of course, grow and change. So I'd like to thank you very, very much indeed, Marianna, for this very profound, I think, conversation, and hope we continue in the future. And thanks to Harry for this leitmotif of vital exhaustion, with the vital bit, the exhaustion bit, and the future to come. Thank you very much indeed.